Welcome back. Today we're going to be reacting to another interview that I have found the transcript to between Palantir former spokesperson and another potential investor. Now, I had previously mentioned that there wasn't really much more for me to say on the Palantir story, having spent 3 years talking about the company, wanting to potentially make some other content. Now, I think that is fair in my eyes, but I have discovered new content that I'm working towards being able to share legally with the fair use, only sharing certain portions of it, commenting on it, modifying to make it new and not violate any copyrights. But really what I've discovered, I think, is of immense value, way better than anything you'd be able to hear from any YouTuber on Palantir. And we're going to be talking about some of it today, but largely I just wanted to set forth some ideas that this could potentially be what you could be seeing over the next few months if it's something you find engaging. Obviously, I'm not going to put all of the work into it if it's not something of value, but I figured I'd give it a few chances here over the next week and see what people think about it. So without further ado, here's a reaction, a multi-part series to this interview.
I work at an investment firm and was spending some time doing research on Palantir and would love to just ask a few questions, given your background at the company. So maybe to start, can you just walk me through a little bit of the history of Palantir?
And so this interview took place in 2020. I'll be reacting in real time going forward.
We're very early in our research and just trying to get up to speed. So a good starting point would just be understanding how did Palantir come about and what the history is.
Yes, and I can give you stuff that is public domain. And to be honest, what I know, I think is entirely public.
So we're just going to skip past this. It's just the background on Palantir that we already know.
Can you walk me through in a little more detail kind of what exactly Foundry does? And what are the pain points that it's solving for customers?
So this is very interesting, right? Because this is the 2020 perspective from a former spokesperson that should be able to articulate exactly what the product does. Obviously, there are a wide range of use cases, but exactly why someone would want to use Foundry. Let's hear what he has to say.
The problem that lots of companies had is one of data being stored in all sorts of different places and using all sorts of different taxonomies. And so you have this problem with a company or government departments that tries to answer questions around anything from things like profitability or gross margin or the availability, especially on the supply chain.
So these are very tangible aspects, right? This is what cuts to the core of why business would choose Foundry. We can save you money, we can speed up your operations, and ultimately that's what you want to do as a business.
The first problem they often face is one of data being held in lots of different places, in different formats where you just can't bring it all together in one place. And what Foundry basically does, and it's like a brilliant tool, it's for developing a single language for data, plugging into lots of different data sources, and then exploring data sources all come from a single place. And that's the way I described it. May sound a little bit boring, but that in itself, that's a very valuable kind of value-added activity that the tool does.
So this is essentially what Palantir does that I really don't see any competitors, I guess you could say, replicating. And it's really core to what the Foundry product was created to do.
But if you have a layer where you can define a common language for the data you're exploring, and then you can plug in different data sources into this common structure that you've defined. So where they've done it for industries, for example, they've done it for supply chains where suppliers, manufacturers, and users of products have completely different taxonomies or ways of describing that product. And what they do is put it into Foundry. And what it lets them do is explore the data and do analytics on it as if it's all come from the same place.
That's helpful. And then remind me again, so then Gotham sits on top of Foundry?
No, it doesn't. Gotham is completely different.
So this is just, a great example of how someone that hasn't put in the time and the work to understand Palantir might be confused about the product. And this is why Palantir needs to continue to do a good job of education on what the company does so that investors that are getting up to speed can better learn and be better informed, right? Because ultimately, you have a very, very small sub-sector and percentage, I guess you could say, of the population that Palantir's product would be useful for, that actually know sort of how it works and know that even just the basic products that Palantir offers and what they do. So what I'm saying is this is very important that Palantir is able to continue to get that marketing out there so their product is actually understood.
Are there any other kind of important platforms within Palantir that are worth talking about from a kind of product perspective?
No.
So this is interesting, right? Because this is a few years back, so Apollo wasn't really, they may have commercialized Apollo. I think that may have come a little later, but Apollo being that third at this point, but still predominant focus on Foundry and Gotham.
So the only two.
Okay, So can you help me understand, like when Palantir would come into a customer, what are the specific problems that Palantir was typically solving for that customer?
So this is another great question. We've gotten some of these answers on Palantir's FoundryCon events, but I really like this question. Let's see what the answer is.
Yes. So it's worth kind of contextualizing that question a little bit. If I were a purist, so an IT architect or data architect, I would object to Palantir because in an organization like a bank, for example, or expensive, other similar organizations, a good data architect would have insisted on it being a single taxonomy for customers and a single taxonomy for transactions, etc. And I wouldn't have the sort of problems that Palantir is trying to sell. So this, as you'll know, this is a common problem across loads of organizations that simply don't, or simply you've never taken the time to manage their data assets properly. And then going back to what I said a second ago, if I was a data architect, I would insist on a sort of purist approach to this, where I would set down data standards across my bank or across my manufacturing plant.
And can you maybe help me understand that from the perspective of different types of... I know that Palantir, obviously, is well known for working with the government, but I suspect has also spent a lot of time with non-government customers. Can you just help me understand what are the different major customer types and how their problems might differ?
I think category-wise, yes. Government, of course, it's very big. Financial services is very big.
And we know that Palantir, if not their first foray into commercial, was very close to when they were first starting out. They actually built out Palantir Finance, which was really one of their first commercial attempts. So financial services, I think, and especially if you consider the background of Alex Karp, where I think it was either a hedge fund or something else where he'd worked before Palantir. It really is, and Peter Thiel, obviously you could draw parallels there, but I think Palantir really is set up, given how much data there is in finance, to really succeed in that domain. So it definitely doesn't surprise me that it's certainly one of those fields that is super successful for.
Manufacturing and logistics is very big. And where it's particularly valuable in the last of those categories is because you have these classic problems of supply chains where there's all sorts of examples, but you have multiple manufacturers of original parts, be it ships or whatever it may be. They have their own way of describing all the stuff, all the products they make. They then ship to someone who actually builds something with them. And that organization then has a different taxonomy, and then often that's sold to an end user, who then has a different taxonomy. And so what Palantir actually do is to integrate the data right across the complex, very dispersed sort of information chain and get a single view of it. And that's the kind of classic problem. The other sort of aspect of this, which is just right across a lot of the organizations I'm talking about, is the humans' decisions being the decision of the output decision being captured and then being reusable for other humans. And whether you're talking about borders, border protection or intelligence or whatever it may be, what Palantir platform does is that it captures data and it develops its idea of a sort of growing data asset, where you start plugging data sources in. But it captures more and more data as you go on. And the value of what you're building becomes incrementally greater.
So this is the demonstration of the flywheel, right? As you get more data, that data becomes more valuable. And that's what's so important for the Palantir product.
And this is a concept for a number of companies I've worked with have used, but it's one that Palantir have really wrapped their arms around and do very effectively. And it means that the value of the implementation is just grows and grows because you're building up a very rich picture of core data. So supply chain or manufacturing data, whatever it is, but also all sorts of human decisions that are taken as a result of that data and what the outcome is. And that's where you really drive very valuable analytics, and of course, you can also drive very valuable machine learning outcomes.
Okay.
But where Palantir has really been hugely successful is that they've just captured the virtuous cycle very well of putting humans into the loop, capturing their insight, codifying it, and then disseminating it widely across much bigger groups of humans.
Got it. Okay.
Wow.
That is helpful. Okay. And do you have a sense, like typically when a customer implements Palantir, is it replacing some other type of analytics platform? Or is it typically that the customer...
Now this is going to be very interesting to hear, right? Because this is essentially getting to the competition, or not even competition, just alternatives, substitutes, if you will, of the Palantir product. So I'm very interesting to see, because the interviewers are asking, is Palantir this next-gen product that isn't really replacing something because it's something like it doesn't exist, or is it replacing, is it essentially a substitute for an existing software within the organization?
Hasn't really had the capacity to do something like this previously?
Exactly.
Yes, that's a really good question, actually. And I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. So the first is to say that I think the way a lot of people outside the company and the wider market regard Palantir is this a sort of category-creating firm, because they have a sort of blend of data engineering, data analytics kind of digitalization. That's all packaged up data together. There are some instances, which you'll find more online about this, but what Palantir's used were generally, the company would never have tried to solve the problem without something like Palantir, because it just wouldn't be feasible or economically viable to do, so that's part.
So that's saying that Palantir enabled a set of outcomes that would not have been otherwise possible. That's saying that there wasn't anything else out there like Palantir, as in Palantir is a unique product without competition in some cases, right?
Of course, there are instances where companies invested tons of money in data engineering, analytics, and all sorts of things with mixed results, not always entirely unsuccessful. But they then switch to something like Palantir.
Okay.
There's other platforms that are similar, but they do so in order to decommission waves of stuff that they've built over the years and get rid of legacy and so on. And so I'm answering your question in a slightly roundabout way, but it's a bit of both actually. But there are instances of companies that have implemented because it allows them to do something they've never been able to do before. I think more typically, it's companies that have just seen it as a very rapid shortcut to deliver analytics and data science that they were doing previously, but with mixed success. And they put the wrapper around all sorts of other efforts.
So that's an interesting take, is saying you could do this on your own. You could do this with some other suite of software. In certain cases, there's obviously so much that could be talked about with the Foundry suite, but it might not be as successful. The yield might not be as good. The error or whatever you're trying to measure might not be as good. Whereas with Palantir, it's set up to work. It's set up to succeed. It might cost you more, but you're getting what you pay for, right? So here is a Palantir spokesperson. Obviously, you got the bias there, but saying that Palantir is differentiated, which we've heard so often from Palantir's executives.
The buyer is not the IT person, because the IT person hasn't quite given the business what they need. It's the business that goes right off of this. Let's go, and let's just take a big shortcut and deliver something that will make me unpopular with the IT team that actually could get me there a lot quicker.
So that's very interesting, is there's this disconnect between IT and where the business actually wants to go. I do recall last year we were talking about, or maybe it was 2021, how to get Palantir, dialogue in terms of marketing and sales better within IT teams, which I think would certainly help to sell the product. But it's very interesting that the business, maybe the executives or some other department, can realize that Palantir, is necessary or will be helpful, even when the IT team is not aware of it or doesn't think that it will be. So I think that's certainly something I hadn't considered.
When you guys would come into a customer, what the implementation process would look like, and how much of it was very hands-on consulting work versus customer just taking a system and working with it themselves?
So this is a good question, because it gets to if Palantir should be considered strictly a software company or a hybrid between software consulting, where they're actually deploying human labor. Let's see what this person says.
You can implement a platform like Palantir or Ripjars, whatever is out there. And you can start with a very vague idea of what the solution looks like. And then you can put it into the hands of users. And you can quite quickly iterate it, change it, throw bits away, and to get to a solution, which may end up actually being really quite different than what you thought you needed at the start. But that doesn't matter, because you put it into an environment, in a process where that's all fine. And you're not really wasting much of any money. It's not like traditional IT deployment. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to point out is that, like a number of products, it's a low-code environment. So whilst you use code in it, it's a sort of tool, again, like a number of others that are in the market doing similar things, but low code, and that you can put it into hands of a relatively non-technical user and achieve quite a lot quite quickly.
Okay, but I guess, and again, obviously, totally understand, you can't disclose anything confidential. But I'm really just asking in generic terms, like my understanding about Palantir, and I know relatively little, is that there is a big consulting component to it.
Here we go.
Meaning, Palantir would come in and do very hands-on implementations and maybe a lot of custom work for its clients, but I could be misunderstanding that.
So here we are, obviously 2020 is when Palantir was getting listed. There was lots of concerns about this, what multiple do you put on Palantir? How do you value it? Is it software? Is it not? I think Palantir's done a good job explaining that it is software, but it's subjective. Ultimately, how you value any company is. But I'm very interested to see what this spokesperson says.
So I'm just trying to understand, is this a product where Palantir could be thought of as a consulting company that has a very high-powered tech platform that enables their consulting services, or is it more of a software company that also has some consulting services alongside that? Does that question make sense? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yes, I know exactly why you are asking the question. It's a software company, right? Make no mistake, it's a software company.
Yep.
I don't think they ever call themselves a consulting company. But it's a software company where the product is used in some very different scenarios.
Yep.
And so there's a fair degree of kind of bespoke, depending on where you're using it. But it's a software business. And I've come from consulting background.
Well, there you
There's
go.
nothing consultancy about it that I can point to, either public or certainly publicly.
Yes. And so we talked about some of the different verticals that the tool is applied in. And obviously, it's very horizontal in the sense that increasingly, and this will be more and more of the case in the future, like almost every business has data and should be doing something with that data. But I'm curious, are there a couple of verticals where, you mentioned, a couple of verticals like manufacturing and government and financial services, where the product is particularly relevant? Was it verticalized around those different use cases? Meaning, was there a version of Palantir that had been built around serving the specific needs of financial institutions or the specific needs of large manufacturing firms, or was it just totally generic?
It's generic. And I don't think there's ever been a plan to make it into a sort of vertical specific product. So it's really strong in organizations that grow through acquisition. And that's particularly applicable in financial services. But equally in organizations like the media and so on, lots of different data stores that have been bolted together over the years and people really struggling with getting value from them. Part of this is demonstrating the odds that are possible to clients. And again, it's not just Palantir that is able to do this, but because these kind of taxonomy-driven platforms, I think, are becoming really powerful these days. Talking to clients and explaining that you can solve problems that they previously had just threw their hands up and said, we just can't do it. That's become fairly mainstream, actually. And what it's led to is some very kind of blue sky thinking around where you can use the platform, really enforcing people to think very widely and climb outside the comfort zones into how they can deploy technology like this.
And one point to clarify. So you mentioned the platform is particularly strong in organizations that have grown through acquisitions and therefore have disparate data sets. Can you just double click on why that's the case? Is that...
So, yeah, this is an interesting point being raised because it's not something I'm aware of, so I'm interested to hear.
Because the strength of the tool isn't standardizing different forms of data?
Yes, it is. Yes, that's the really key part to this. Yes, it's hard. So it's able to take things like latency and formatting. And the fact that you've got data coming in at different times to different databases, some of it is time critical. It's not a problem. It can account for the fact that data is uploaded every second as one database and into another database every hour. And it doesn't get thrown by that. You can configure it to take account of that very easily. For example, if you were to speak to your kind of old-fashioned IT person and they point out their data is all over the place in all sorts of different data structures, different ownerships, all sorts of other stuff, products like Palantir or Ripjars, what they can do is that they can take care of all of the problems associated with that.
I see. Okay. And then on the point of the customer base, again, I understand that you're limited in what you can say, but can you just give me a broad brushstrokes of how you would break down the customer base, either by industry or by size, how concentrated it is? I'm just trying to understand the average size of the customers that they're serving and whether the business is 90% government or 50% government. And again, you don't have to say a specific number. I'm just trying to understand kind of orders of magnitude.
So we understand that the business is roughly split at this point, in 2022 at least is roughly 50-50, 60-40, however you want to look at it, obviously skewing to much larger corporations, Fortune 500s and the like. I don't think it was that different in 2020, but let's see the answer.
It's a lot of government. As I couldn't give you a number actually, I really couldn't, but it's a lot.
Yeah, we do know that the government has been surpassed a bit by the commercial growth. So certainly in 2020, the government segment was larger, but as a percentage of the total revenue that has shrunk over time.
Of it is government, but then a rapidly growing bit of it in FS, and very rapidly growing in wider, non-specific manufacturing. When I say FS, I mean it's banking, actually. That's the really big area, I think. FS, financial services, is obviously a very large market. But it's banking, particularly retail banking, that's a really key area.
It sounds like you were sort of part of this sales organization broadly defined. How did Palantir go out and win customers?
Here we go back to the sales piece. And yeah, I think this is super important because this was before Palantir had a sales department, right? And they still had to sell the product. So I'd be very interested to get some context on the history and how Palantir was doing sales previously.
It's business development based on shoe leather that everyone else has to do, unfortunately. There is something about the Palantir product, which is unusual and worth pointing out. Again, this is known publicly, but it's worth just flagging it to you, which is that it's the speed of deployment. And it's the way the deployment model is based on this sort of almost neo-military way of doing things. So lots of the language is from the armed forces almost. But what it means is that when there's a kind of high impact or critical situation, Palantir pounds very quickly. And be it intelligence failure or a business that's struggling with some kind of almost existential problem or something like a pandemic, it's moving at great speed to offer a very accessible solution to managing a very complex mass data organization. That's where Palantir thrives particularly. But that's, by no means, the sole business development model because a lot of it is just really traditional kind of nuts and bolts, talking to clients. It's a fact that the speed of deployment is so fast and the whole company is configured in very fast deployment. That, in itself, is a very powerful means of going to market for some clients. Obviously, for other clients because it's not valuable in the slightest, but it's a lot like never seen before. And again, this is known about publicly, but what it means is that sort of problem like the pandemic, and you need to manage it and manage aspects of it. Palantir is a very attractive solution because despite the power of the tech and so on, you can have it switched on and working far more quickly than pretty much anyone else. Obviously, there's value attached to that.
Got it. And is it broken out geographically? Or how is the go-to-market effort structured?
But it's in such a state of kind of flux and confusion, I don't know. It's one of those things the company has changed its mind on quite a few times. I thought, well, no.
Meaning, they've changed their mind on how to structure the go-to-market teams and so forth?
I think they've tried various models. And I don't know exactly how they do it now. I think they have a varied model depending on which market they're going after. I mean, and by that, the US market, both in government or particularly government, but also commercial, it's pretty mature and established. And so they have a different strategy there than they would have in somewhere like the Far East, for example, where the company is not really very well known. And they're quite adaptive to the different markets. There isn't a kind of global template for how they do business development.
So what about competitively, like who are considered the main competitors to Palantir?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. Actually, I know the market very well, completely aside from my employment at Palantir.
So this is hopefully going to be a good answer here, given his experience in consulting. Obviously, we moved past that. Palantir's a software company, so what sort of software companies do you compare it to?
And so there's a number of different companies that are doing something that looks a little bit similar to Palantir. And if you want to see a company that's very similar, in the UK, there's a company called Ripjar. I mentioned them previously. They're a bunch of guys who came out of GCHQ, equivalent of the NSA over here. The reason I mention them is that if you look at their website, they talk very much about the financial services and anti-money laundering and these kind of use cases. But in reality, they built something that's very similar. And the reason I mention the semantic web is that what Palantir have done, which is, yes, genius in a way, is to just take a sort of a usable extract of the idea of the semantic web. So by building this taxonomy layer, it's not a pure kind of semantic way of looking at data, but it's a step in that direction. And there's a number of companies who are doing something quite similar. Ripjar, I think what you should probably look at has been the closest equivalent. There's a lot of companies who are building very intuitive low-code environment for integrating data. Now Palantir would scoff at the suggestion of their competitors. But if you look at someone like even Tableau, which is obviously now owned by Salesforce, Tableau have built a tool called Tableau Prep. For them, it's all about making data visualizations easier. But on the other hand, yes, if you look at it and you look at what Palantir does, it's on a different scale, and it's nothing like as mature as Palantir, but it's a tool that's starting to look a bit like it.
So just Tableau, and I have very basic experience with it. It seems like it's just the visualizations part. It's not the intelligence behind the visualizations. I could be wrong on that, but I think he's bringing up Tableau because it's certainly doing something similar to some capacity, right? And Salesforce owns it. So you could label Salesforce as a competitor. I think that's fair. As well as this Ripjar, I need to actually look into it. This is the first time I'm hearing of it.
Further down that path is Alteryx. So the main Alteryx tool, which I've used, I think it's brilliant. Again, it's nothing like as powerful or exactly competent as Palantir. But on the other hand, for quite a lot of users, Alteryx is walking down that path as well. Now, I suspect if you said to some purists at Palantir, you compared you made the comparisons I've just made. They would say, there's an awful lot that something like some of the Palantir tools can do that Tableau Prep or Alteryx couldn't do. And that would be true, no question about it. But for a lot of users, being able to integrate data, normalize it, put it into a single format, and then run analytics on it, actually, that answers a lot of their questions. And Alteryx have I don't know if you know the company, but it's a listed US Silicon Valley startup again. But it's impressive software, and almost every sort of 6 to 10 weeks, there's a new release of it. And it works really well. So just an example, but that's some of the kind of competitive landscape. And then, as I mentioned right at the start of our call, this whole question around good data governance. And this is a quite old-fashioned thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. You have banks and other companies that actually are getting their acts together around data architecture. And yes, there are banks, I could name quite a few in the UK, which have really made a huge effort to make that data, to normalize their data, implement data standards. And actually, they didn't need Palantir. And so I'd put a marker down, saying that there's quite a few companies that are overcoming the data architecture problem in a way that means that something like a Palantir or Ripjar is not needed. And it's worth potential investors, I guess, but quite a lot of the value of these platforms is tied up in the fact that enterprise architecture has failed.
So let me know if this was something you enjoyed. I have so much more of this that I would like to share in small segments. You know, what I find to be most valuable, share my insights on it. So if this is something you enjoyed and want to see more of, certainly let me know, and I will try and do some of it every week. If it's not something you enjoyed, well, I'm not sure you would be still watching at this point. Until next time.